Welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. This is Catching Up on Kakaako. We're talking about digging up the Kakaako Makai Landfill. This is a big issue. It won't be easy and it won't be cheap with the urban planner Lee Sichter, University of Hawaii. So Lee is going to help us understand the problems associated with the landfill subsurface under Kakaako Makai, the toxins and other materials that are there, whether business or residential structures can be built on it, what has to be done to remediate or remove it, and how much will that cost for any development in the area. Yeah, welcome to the show, Lee. Lee Sichter, urban planner par excellence. Thank you for joining us today. I want to mention, Lee, that there were four, not one, not two, not three, but four articles in the newspaper just yesterday. The one is in the Star Advertiser called Conundrum. It's by State Representative Scott Saiki and Senator Sharon Moriwaki. Island Voices by Governor Neil Abercrombie, former governor. He was the guy that oversaw that deal back in 2012 anyway. The third one was Let Good Public Planning for Kakaako Waterfront Prevail, by our old friend Richard Barreca. Okay, so this is really a hot topic, Lee, and you're the guy who can tell us about the landfill, what's in there and how's it affecting. And the first question I put to you is what's in the landfill, what's in the soils, and what's in the groundwater that affects our decision process in terms of urban planning?
Well, Jay, thank you. First of all, I want to say as a professional planner, I'm objective on this matter. I'm not taking sides one way or another. I'm looking at finding information because after the end of the day, the definition of planning is collaborative problem solving. And we need to come together as a community and solve this problem. Let's start with some of the very basics. The elevation of Kakaako Makai is on the average about 5 feet above sea level. The original reef shelf that it was built on is about 15 to 20 feet below sea level. There's groundwater that's presently about 5 to 8 feet below ground level. You dig down a trench in Kakaako Makai, you go down deeper than 5 or 6 feet, you're probably going to hit groundwater. There's also believed to be what's called a confined basal aquifer below the groundwater table that provides drinking water, but we don't know how deep that aquifer actually is. So let's look at how did we end up with this situation. In 1900, the population of Honolulu was about 58,000 people. Jay, I want to ask you, what do we do with our garbage today?
Well, isn't there a landfill way out in Waianae somewhere, or do we ship it to the mainland?
Well, no, we take it to H-Power and burn it, right?
Right.
And dump all the ash in the landfill, the Waimanalo Gulch landfill.
Yeah.
Well, that's always been the solution, and that's what was going on over 100 years ago. Beginning in the 1860s, the city collected municipal garbage and they burned it in open fires along the shoreline east of Honolulu Harbor. In 1900, there was a road called Ala Moana Road, and it was right along the shoreline between downtown and what we now call Atkinson Boulevard. The land on the Makai side of that road, on the ocean side, was mudflats, salt pans, tide pools, fringing reef. The land mauka of the road was marshes and wetlands and fish ponds. Kakaako Makai did not exist. In the 1920s, the government built a new seawall extending east from Honolulu Harbor so that the mudflats and the coral reef behind it could be filled in. During the early 1930s, the mudflats and the reef were dredged to create Kewalo Basin and the channel that leads into it, so that the tuna fishing fleet could be moved out of Honolulu Harbor. Things were getting too busy at the harbor, so they wanted to create a new place for the big tuna fleet. So they dredged Kewalo Basin. The dredged materials that they took out were piled up along the western side, and that was the beginning of Kakaako Makai, and along the coast right in front of Ala Moana Road. That was the beginning of Kakaako Makai. In 1930, Honolulu constructed its first garbage incinerator at what is now 117 Ahui Street, right near Kewalo Basin. On the Oha parcel, it's on their parcel B, it's in the southeast corner of that parcel. Can we see that first map of the current lands? Right, good. That's a map of the OHA lands, and they were also the sites that were studied for soil contamination. In the middle there, at the bottom, is Waterfront Park. This is a map, a 1901 map of Honolulu. The shape of Waterfront Park is overlaid along the coastline just to the right of the channel going into Honolulu Harbor. So there's no Kakaako Makai there. It's just a shoreline and then extends out to a reef. But we've on this map, they've overlaid what the Kakaako Waterfront Park would look like today if it were overlaid on that map. And you see there's just no Kakaako Makai around it. In the 1940s, the city added a second incinerator in the same area, right next to Kewalo Basin. The original incinerator was taken out of service in the 40s, and it became home of the United Fishing Agency's fish auction area. Some of the kupuna might remember there was a fish auction facility down by Kewalo Basin. That was where the first incinerator was. A new incinerator was constructed on Ojai Street, and that is now where the Children's Discovery Center is. That incinerator site was repurposed to become the Children's Discovery Center. All of the ash created by burning the city's garbage at those three incinerators over 30 years was used to fill in and create what we now know as Kakaako Makai. The large boulders that create the shoreline, by Point Panic and along the edge there, those came from Punchbowl when they were building the National Cemetery of the Pacific. Another seawall was built further seaward to create a larger area where the ash could be dumped. But long after the peninsula was filled in with ash, the piling of ash and garbage continued in the center along the shoreline to create a municipal landfill for garbage and ash. That's the area that we know today as Waterfront Park.
So it's not only ash from the incinerator, it's old-fashioned garbage.
Right, it's old-fashioned garbage and some construction debris as well, and some of the dredged material. The state finally ordered the city to stop dumping fill at Kakaako Makai in 1971, and the last incinerator was shut down in 1977. That's how we got here. All of Kakaako Makai is fill, and it's ash and dredged material from Kewalo Basin and garbage and construction debris. But on top of that, there is a huge mound that was the municipal landfill.
So if I walk through Kakaako Makai right now and I walk on the green grass, can you tell me how deep the topsoil is and how far down I have to go to reach all that ash and trash and landfill material?
It's probably about less than 6 feet.
Wow.
Yeah. Can we go to slide number 6, please? This is when they were putting in the liner, the PVC liner, on top of the sanitary landfill, and then they covered that with topsoil. So it's just a liner that was used to create the barrier between the contaminated soil and today the grass on top of on the hills in Waterfront Park. And that tube there in the middle is a vent that allows methane to escape, because if you allow methane to build up underneath, you can have spontaneous combustion and you can end up having a fire underground. So that those tubes, those are vents at Waterfront Park. You can see them today. They're only about a foot high, but they vent methane out because of the garbage that's still there. Well,
so what is this membrane made of, and how thick is it, and how strong is it?
It's a plastic material. I don't know how thick it is. It's probably less than an inch thick, and then it's covered with soil. It's a way of capping. So in 2009, there was a report that was done, and this report has been floating around. It's called the Limtiako study, and it was dated June 2009. I've not seen the data that that report is based on. I've only seen the report itself. The report tested a number of sites around where those incinerators were. The report did not test the municipal landfill, the waterfront park property itself, but it tested the areas around it, and those happen to be the same areas that that were transferred to OHA. The report found evidence of petroleum, hydrocarbons, pesticides, and heavy metals, including lead and mercury, at several areas around the old incinerator sites and in areas where the ash was used to fill in behind the seawall. Not every contaminant was found at every site they tested, but every site they tested, except for what OHA calls its parcel E, every other site is contaminated. A point here, this material is not hazardous under federal guidelines. It's not considered to be hazardous material. It's considered to be contaminated soil, which is nasty stuff, but it doesn't rise to the level of federal hazardous waste. What about those hydrocarbons and those heavy metals that the study found? They're not hazardous waste, but they're nasty. Where did they come from? Automobiles and later plastics. Think, when they built the first incinerator, 1930s. Not many cars. There were some cars, but not many. But then over time, we got more and more cars, and you start to see more and more batteries and car parts and stuff dumped in the trash. There were no plastics in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s. We started to see plastics emerge in the 60s. The same thing with pesticides. So the closer we get to current, the more nasty stuff we throw away in our garbage. And if that incinerator was operating until 1971 or 1977, then you can figure that the very early landfill that they were doing with the ash coming out of the incinerators in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, that was probably pretty clean stuff, extending out from Ala Moana Road. But then the further you get Makai, where they're filling in more and more land, the more recent that ash is, and probably the more toxic it is because of the automobile residue and the plastics and the pesticides that were thrown away in the garbage.
So, but as such, though, it doesn't violate the federal standards. On the other hand, there's groundwater. Can you talk about the groundwater in the area and how far away it is from that, and how that material, that toxic material, can reach the groundwater and become dangerous?
Well, yeah, okay, remember I started out by saying the groundwater is probably 5 to 8 feet below ground level. Ground level is 5 feet above sea level. So you'd have to dig down just about to sea level, and you've hit groundwater. We referred to the June Limtiako report. Well, there's a second report that's not floating around, and it was dated September 2009. And in that report, Limtiako presented 6 alternatives for how to remediate the soil, what to do with this. Number 1, alternative was no action. Don't do anything on the land. Number 2, 3, and 4 were all different forms of caps. Number 2 was putting a gravel cap, 6 inches of gravel over all the land, and then put soil on top of that. Alternative 3 was cover the whole area with asphalt and then put soil on that. That's called an asphalt cap. Number 4 was a geomembrane layer. That's that plastic material that they did. They actually did that geomembrane layer at the municipal landfill and has a soil cap on top of about 6 inches. Those are 3 forms of caps that could be used. The 5th alternative was take out all the soil. Just get rid of this and replace it with clean soil.
You don't mean soil, you mean all the material. Take out all the
contaminated soil. Take out all the contaminated soil and replace it with clean soil. And the 6th alternative was take out the contaminated soil and wash it, and then put it back into the ground. Limtiako, September 2009 report evaluated all those alternatives. They recommended that if you pursued alternative 5, which was to remove all the contaminated soil and get rid of it, you'd have to take it down to a depth of 12 feet. Now, remember, groundwater is 5 to 8 feet below. So they're saying you're going to have to take the top 5 feet of dirt off of the landfill, plus go down into the wet groundwater soil. And you're going to have to remove all that. And they estimated that volume to be 680,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil from the sites that they tested, which are essentially the same sites that were transferred to Ojo. If you consider a standard pickup truck, a dump truck, a standard dump truck contains about 10 to 16 cubic yards. That's what it can carry. If you assume the upper limit, it would take to remove 680,000 cubic yards of soil, it would take 42,500 one-way dump truck trips.
Wow.
To get rid of all that soil. And some of that soil is going to be wet. They rejected that as an alternative. There is no landfill on Oahu that could accept that soil or would accept that contaminated soil. And there's no place where we can get 680,000 cubic yards of clean soil to replace it. So that one's off the table. So then the question becomes, can you wash it? Well, if it's contaminated, what do you do with the effluent, the wash water that you use to rinse all of the materials out? You can't put that back in the ocean. You can't put that back on the ground. You're going to have to contain it and get rid of it. So they rejected both alternatives 5 and 6 as infeasible. It would cost too much. They estimated that the cost to remove the contaminated soil would be between $204 and $272 million, assuming $300 to $400 a cubic yard. $272 million just to remove the soil. It's just not cost effective. It's not possible. You could try shipping it to the mainland. I don't know who you'd get to take it. And there's probably EPA permits that go along with that. So it's just the alternatives of just pulling the soil out and replacing it with clean soil. It's not feasible. That leaves alternatives 2, 3, or 4, the capping. That's what they did at the municipal landfill. They did alternative 4. They capped it with the plastic sheeting and then put soil on top. Here's the issue, Jay. If you install a cap to protect everybody from this contaminated soil, what can you build on top of the cap?
Right.
Can you build a slab on grade, a concrete slab, and then put a structure on top of that? I don't know the answer to that. Lim Tiako said that you shouldn't build above 22 feet.
From the surface.
From the surface.
22 feet is 2 stories.
Yeah, that's 2 stories. They were assuming in their report that there would be no ground disturbance of the contaminated soil. But if you want to go taller than 22 feet, you're going to have something like piles or something that need to be driven into the ground to stabilize the structure. Like I said the last time we talked, there's plenty of buildings in downtown Honolulu that were built on fill material, but it wasn't contaminated soil. It was just fill material. But they used piles that have to go down 40, 50, 60 feet in order to stabilize the building.
Yeah, I've seen them drive piles for a lot of the downtown buildings.
You've heard it too. They can be very loud.
Yeah.
So what happens if you drive a pile through a cap?
Right.
That you've used to protect us from the contaminated soil?
Right.
Does driving that pile through the cap introduce contamination to a lower depth?
I'll give you a lay answer. Yes.
It would seem that way, but we don't know for sure. So I'll just take it one step further. We're talking a lot about climate change, but it's a little bit more complicated than just sea level rise. Fresh water floats on salt water. It's lower density than salt water. And that's the lens, the lens of fresh water floating on top of the salt water. That's that brackish water that we get in our groundwater. Well, a study was done in 1990, a Mink and Lau study, that said that there was a lower aquifer of drinkable water under the groundwater at Kakaako Makai. But the Mink study doesn't it isn't revealed in the Limtiaco how deep that second aquifer is. So I simply don't know if the driving of piles down into the ground to support a tall structure could introduce contamination further down than it is now and possibly conflict with the aquifer, the drinkable water aquifer. And in these times of Red Hill, we have to be very concerned about the integrity of our aquifer. These are all questions that we just don't know the answers to.
Well, let me ask you this. If you have to drive the pile for a tall building, 50, 60 feet, and all the buildings downtown were in that range of depth, and downtown is almost at sea level. It's very,
It's about the same as Kakaako Makai, 5 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then what you're doing is you're opening a hole, so to speak, into levels far below both the surface and the sea level. And the question I put to you, do we know the depth of this aquifer? And
No.
if I say 50 or 60 feet, am I going to penetrate the aquifer?
We don't, right now, with the information that's available, we don't know the answer to that. That answer may be out there somewhere, but we don't know it. That's something that needs to be found out.
Well, let me ask you this. We have sea level rise. It's very clear.
Yeah.
Chip Fletcher at the university has made detailed maps of how that's going to work from year to year, decade to decade, and foot to foot, so to speak. And other effects of climate change, like extreme weather, like storms that affect the water level, the seawater level around the shoreline. So how does sea level rise and climate change in general affect the process you just described?
Well, it raises the potable water table and brings the potable water, the drinkable water, closer to the contaminated soil, because fresh water floats on salt water. And if the salt water level is raising with sea level, that means the fresh water floating on top of it is also going to lift up higher. And that potentially would seem just logically to bring it closer to the contaminated soil. That's why we need to find out right now, is the groundwater under Kakaako Makai actually contaminated or not by the contaminated soil that we know is there? If not, will it become contaminated in the future with sea level rise? We don't know, but we need to find out. So it's premature to start talking about the future land uses at Kakaako until we get these basic questions answered. What is the condition of the soil in the larger area? Like I said, not every toxin was found at every site, but every site was found to be contaminated. Where exactly are the heavy metals, the mercury, the lead? Where are the hydrocarbons? Are they spread all over, or are there pockets of them? We need that answer. It would be best to have some kind of additional study done that really would start to reveal some of this information. Then we can make reasonable decisions about what can we build there. For example, if you're going to build a residential tower, you're going to need a new sewer line. You're going to need a new water line. But if you've capped the land to protect from the contaminated soil, where do you put your sewer line? If you dig through the cap, you've compromised the cap and you're exposing everything to contaminated soil. Do you put your new sewer line on top of the cap, on top of the ground? I don't know. But there's a lot of questions here that need to be answered before we make some choices about future land use.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what we can do. We don't know what can be built there safely, prudently. And I mean, there's no other study. Am I right? There's no other study, not by OHA, certainly not by the legislature, to determine what can be built there or how high it can be. You said 22 feet was 2 stories considered earlier, but gee whiz, how about 400 feet? That's taking a deep dive, so to speak. What's the dark side of this? If we build without knowing the answers to these questions, what could happen?
People are exposed to contamination. People are exposed to heavy metals. people are exposed to hydrocarbons, lead and mercury. We don't know. We simply don't know.
Well, aside from all that, raising all those issues, those questions that we don't have answers for, there is the EIS requirement under state and possibly federal law. How does that play on all of this?
Well, it's under state law. It says that the use of state land or the use of government agency funds triggers Chapter 343. So an EIS would have to be done. As part of an EIS, you typically do hydrological studies. You typically do geotechnical analysis. That would mean understanding what the subsurface is. You typically do soil studies. So if any EIS was done, it would have to cover all those bases. But you don't necessarily need to cover those bases and wait for the EIS to do it. You could commission those studies first. The geotech, the soils analysis, the hydrology analysis, understand what's the condition of the soil, what's the substructure of the land, what's the condition of the groundwater and the aquifer. You can do that first, and then that will dictate what you possibly can do in the future on the land.
So if you were going to appear or talk to the legislature or a legislator considering a bill that would allow high-rise residential development in this area, what would your advice be?
Well, I'd have 1 minute to do that because that's the amount of time they give you to testify. So I'd have to fill in a lot in 1 minute. My advice would be to defer on the current action, and that's exactly what I told the committee last week in testimony. Defer on the current bill, have OHA, wait for OHA to do its EIS, its mandatory EIS, and get the results. And then use that, as Chapter 343 says, to inform decision makers. Make decisions based upon the facts. That's my advice.
Yeah, evidence-based decision making. Right now, there is no evidence.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lee. Lee Sichter, urban planner, University of Hawaii. Thank you so much for joining us today and discussing this very important topic. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.